So for years, people had thought of everything that happened, and every time we landed, people improved on the ideas and said, well, that worked well, this was a problem.
Normandy differed from the fighting in the Pacific because when we isolated these Japanese atolls, they rarely could reinforce their garrisons. This was extremely important. In Normandy, it was a huge beachhead, potential beachhead, and the Germans were capable of reinforcing them more rapidly, and they could defeat our landings unless we advanced on a broad front. We did it rapidly. We had to gain surprise.
You know, their main objective that day was to get the men and equipment to the shore. And it was just, you know, pour the coal on, get all the way to the beach, and don't stop until the boat stops.
They were training us at that time for the Pacific Theater. And we had to do a lot of training within the swamps and living in the swamps in water almost to our waist. But of course, that's what the troops on the islands in the Pacific had to contend with. So they put us through a program that was as realistic as they could, you know. And then they didn't tell us where we were going, but we didn't know until they shipped us over to the port of New York City and put us on the Queen Mary. So it was quite a miserable walk to get on that boat. But then once we were on the boat, we learned immediately that we were headed for England because the crew knew where they were going. And they told us and passed it on to the soldiers coming on ship, you know.
They put us in a tent in Ivy Bridge in the cold of winter. This was January. And mud on the floor. We slept in our overcoats to keep warm. We were spoken to by Colonel Charles D.W. Canham from a stage, just like Patton was in that movie, Patton, and he used some foul language. He said, 2 out of 3 of you are not going back to the States because we're going to be the spearhead of the second front. Anybody that's got butterflies in his belly, speak up now and we'll transfer you. And they transferred some guys out.
The troops had already been designated into boat groups. They were counted off to a specific number of people and task loaded. At Normandy, they had an assortment of people with various weapons and specialties, a leader and a sergeant in each boat, really about a platoon. And they were well designated, well trained, all to work together. They had practiced for months climbing scramble nets or cargo nets. They had practiced running out of LCVPs. They knew where their place was in the boat. They had that part of it down.
We trained in boat teams. We lived, slept, and ate in boat teams. So we all knew each other. And we trained on the moors with mock-up assault boats. And we were trained to go out of the assault boats and fan out and attack pillboxes. And they did it so many times that it became rote. You could do it in your sleep.
As we trained for the D-Day landings in England and Wales, we found a number of locations that were actually surprisingly close to the French coastline. And one of them at Slapton Sands actually resembled some of the beach at Omaha actually quite well. You had that sloping soil leading up to the escarpment. It was actually very close. And we trained extensively. Most of the training exercises started off poorly, and then as we advanced and gained experience, actually turned out rather well.
Now, the practice landings on the southwest coast of England, which was called Slapton Sands, were a picnic compared to D-Day because the little boats were waiting for us in the water. A nice sunlit day, balmy seas. We climbed down the cargo nets. We got into our little boats. Every man had a certain position. We landed, it was a picnic. We went nice little cruise to the beach, and the pillboxes, the topography was exactly like D-Day. The big 100-foot bluff in front of us. May 15th, we got driven in a truck to a special camp called a sausage, because it was shaped like a sausage. We were in Camp D1. They had a mock-up of the beach we were going to hit. in a clay mock-up. We even had airplane pictures taken from P-38s of the Germans working on the beach with these terrible obstacles they were putting in, 4 rows.
One man was so fearful that he was going to die on that beach that he told me, he said, Sergeant Reynolds, he says, how many times do we have to do this? He said the odds that are going to catch up with us, we can't continue with this fighting. And I just shrugged my shoulder and what is there to do except fight, you know? We have no option. So they called it off for 24 hours, and then when we set sail again, we were immediately introduced to the sandboxes again and our assignments and what was expected of us, the penetration that we were to make.
Omaha Beach was 4.5 miles long by 300 yards wide at low tide. At high tide, there was no beach. Now, the 1st Division was going to land on the eastern part, which turned out to be the soft part. My other battalions, you know, the 2nd and 3rd Battalion, were going to land in between on dog red, dog white, and each had a dog insignia. Ours was dog green, the smallest of the beaches, most heavily defended.
It was possible on the first load, and sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't, to load troops right off the deck. They would winch the LCVPs over the side, load the troops, and then lower the whole thing. But if they did that, they would only do it the first time. And so the preferred and typical method were for troops to climb down the scramble nets or cargo nets from the troop deck down into the LCVP. And that was difficult, of course, because the LCVP was going up and down, and the troop transport would be going up and down.
12 miles out in that storm that had blown up and canceled the first day, it hadn't let down that day. The prediction was that it would subside, and it did because we made it ashore. But it was still very, very bad.
This started very early in the morning, I think as early as 3 o'clock. They didn't have enough side on the boat to get all the LCVPs loaded at once.
It was pitch black, 3:30 in the morning. The weather was horrible. The wind was going at 10 miles an hour. The waves were up to 20 feet high, 15 to 20 feet. And they had to lower us over the sides already in the boats. But the minute we were lowered over the side, the boats hit the water, were thrown around like matchsticks. Every man was immediately soaked with the icy cold English Channel water. So we were freezing. The water got up to our knees. So in order to stay afloat for 3 hours, we had to be bailing out with the helmets, and we were all freezing.
So once you were loaded, you had to take your LCVP with the others who had just loaded, and you would start making circles in the ocean. And of course that means sometimes you're going with the waves and sometimes you're going against them. It makes for a very rough ride.
That was another thing in those assault boats. You smelled that diesel, plus the salt water and the waves would make anybody sick.
It was such a stinking mess that alone was enough to kill a man, from the stench of the diesel oil and the puke.
Everybody was very somber in the boat. You couldn't hear anybody talking. There were 3 guys vomiting in my boat up in the front, sitting in the water and crying. Most of the guys were praying. I was praying.
Eventually you get all of the people in your landing wave together, and they're all going in a circle, and somebody decides it's time to go now. And then you would come out of the circle into a line, and you would charge the beach all together.
Dog Green sector was so small in length that it wouldn't support a whole battalion landing abreast of each other, 24 boats, not even 2 companies. So we had to come in sequence So we came in A, B, D, and C.
The coxswains were taught to hit the beach and keep full throttle on, drop the ramp. Everybody unloads. The LCVP is not armored. There's the ramp is steel, but honestly, they're very exposed.
The men, in some cases, were encouraged when they saw the naval gunfire and heard the deafening roars of battleships and cruisers firing into the beaches.
The battleship Texas then was part of our firepower, but they had to stay 12 miles out because they had big guns, coastal guns, at Longy-sur-Mer. They could blow the battleship Texas out of the water. So they had to stay 12 miles out. These rough seas, dark of night, they fired over the beach. They were only going to fire from 5:55 to 6:25 when the guys were going to land, 6:30. The Navy also had an LCI barge fitted out with 1,000 rocket launchers. They were going to fire 4,000 5-inch rockets at Dog Green Sector, blow up some of the obstacles, get the guys to keep their heads down. Unfortunately, they had to go 12 miles out. So I saw these rockets coming in. They looked like a flock of birds, but they landed harmlessly in the water. The first thing I saw, a Company B boat on my left, port side, blew up, hit a mine. We were showered with wood, metal, and body parts. So we only had 180 men now. When our ramp went down, the signal for every machine gun on that beach to open up on the exit to our ship. The fellow in front of me, Clarice Riggs, was machine gunned on the ramp. I dove in behind him. Only my left side of my helmet was creased by a bullet. I was standing in neck-deep, bloody water with my rifle over my head. So we were losing men right and left. The water was full of blood. We started running across the beach. We were about 500 yards out. So we're neck-deep in water. When we got to the actual beach, the sand was wet and tide was treacherous. It went out fast and came in fast. When we got to about 135 yards away from the seawall, a machine gun spray came from the trenches up on the bluff, and I heard a loud thud on my right front and my rifle vibrated. I turned it over. There was a clean hole through its receiver. Another thud behind me to the left, and that guy was gone too. I hit the sand behind the hedgehog, which is about 130 yards from the seawall.
I went down behind it on one knee, but the bullets were coming through that hedgehog. And it seemed to me they were coming between my legs, under my arms, that I realized that I had to move. And I got up and in one run made it all the way through that 300 yards or so to the shingles. And that was the next stop that I made. And at the shingles, we couldn't get any further because of the barbed wire, and it held us up. And for about an hour, or a little longer, hour and 10 minutes, hour and 20 minutes.
Now, there are only two of us alive from my boat team, Charles Connor and myself. We had 85% casualties first 15 minutes.
The Germans zeroed in from their strong points on the beaches, on the likely advancing. Dog Green is a perfect example. They had zeroed in with crossfire, and they literally shot down many of the men before they even got out of the boats. It was pretty bad. The first wave suffered horrifically, even the second wave for that matter.
The tide pools were full of bloody water. The beach itself looked like it was painted with a red paintbrush. So we were left with options. Stay there and die, give up the beach to the Germans, or fight wounded. We decided to fight wounded.